I want to welcome everybody here for joining today's webinar, Preventing Project Pitfalls, 5 Critical Site Assessments. I'm Rob Hernandez. I will be your moderator today. Just before we get started, I do want to let people know that we are recording this session. We'll make sure that we share the replay of this and the slides with you after, so just watch for an email with that information. During the course of our webinar, if you have questions for us, you may ask them at any time using the Q&A feature at the top of your screen. We have saved time at the end to get to some of those questions, and we'll get to as many of those as possible. So let's go ahead and kick off with maybe just a few introductions. I'll go ahead and start. As I mentioned, I'm Rob Hernandez. I've been with Terracon for about 18 years. My background is geotechnical, and so having a webinar like this where we get to speak to a little bit more of an environmental point of view, it's really nice to be able to learn and enjoy that. So I'll go ahead and pass it on to Emily, and then we'll just make it around the horn.
Hey, I'm Emily Kosmalski. I've been with Terracon for 18 years. I sit in the Atlanta, Georgia office. I'm the Associate Director of our National Accounts Program, but prior to this time, I actually have 18 years of environmental planning experience. I've worked on a wide variety of projects across the United States, ranging from cell towers to roadway widenings to power facilities. And my specialty is the National Environmental Policy Act.
Thank you, Emily. Nate?
Thanks, Rob. Nate Boyles. I'm the National Manager for Environmental Innovation and Technology at Terracon. I'm relatively new to my role. I'm 7 months in. I'm coming over from a recent acquisition of Metcalf Archaeology, headquartered out of Golden, Colorado. That's where I'm sitting today. Previous to that, I was 16 years at Metcalf, leading the company as the president and CEO before we were acquired last year. My background's archaeology, cultural resource management, and most of my work after 20 years or so in the industry is focused in cultural resource management.
Great. Thank you, Nate. And Eric?
Afternoon, folks. Eric Wooten. I've been with Terracon almost 3 years now. Prior to joining Terracon, I have a legal background and worked in a lot of environmental compliance and sustainability work. For Terracon, I focus on a lot of our greenhouse gas program nationally, as well as helping clients with sustainability as one of our sustainability and resiliency practice resource leads. Recently, I've taken on a lot of governmental affairs work, building on the work I did for Occidental as a regulatory senior affairs advisor.
That's great. Thank you, Eric. Well, let's go ahead and jump into our presentation today. And I just want to give just a little bit of a background on Terracon for those on the call. We are a 7,000 professional firm strong with over 180 offices nationwide. Terracon's core services are facilities, environmental, geotechnical, and materials. And we are proudly celebrating our 60th anniversary this year. So we've had a lot of really fun activities, a lot of really good discussions on 60 years and how we can move forward and continue to have safe, profitable growth. So it's just a really great time to be an employee at Terracon. We also have a very strong safety culture here at Terracon, which we call IIF, and it's incident and injury free. We like to start all of our meetings with an IIF moment where we are bringing just a topic of safety to mind, just so that people can just be thinking about that as you move throughout your day. So for today, I just want to highlight the upcoming safety week that we have beginning from May 5th through 9th. And it's kind of the beginning of our high risk season when things really start to ramp up, you get really busy, and it's a time when you really need to be keeping safety really close to you, even when you get busy and you think that you just, there's just so much to do during the day. Really just be thinking about why you're safe, why you work safe. I have a picture of my family up here on the slide, and that's who I work safely for, is for my family, so that when I go home each and every evening, I have them, and I can be thankful that I'm at a company that has a strong culture of safety and that I can spend my evenings with them. All right, so we are going to be talking today about 5 critical assessments. So these critical assessments that we're going to talk about today are visualize development restrictions and potential pitfalls, identify permitting requirements and constraints, map out compliance with applicable regulations, uncover funding sources and recognize associated project impacts, and embrace public relations and community engagement. So as we dive into the first assessment, I'd like to go ahead and just turn this over to Emily for some opening remarks and just opening discussion. Emily?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Rob. So I think in this day and age, it's really important to leverage and understand the technology that is available to make you as knowledgeable as humanly possible as early in the life cycle as possible. So, we've got the project life cycle up on the screen. We select our sites, we design, we mitigate, we manage assets, we construct. I mean, that's the full spectrum of the things that we do. But at the very beginning, when your project is just an inkling of an idea, when you're trying to figure out where you're going to locate, what you're going to do, you're looking at different site locations, it's important to be as armed with as much information and knowledge as humanly possible. And that's where technology comes into play. So, we have available resources across the internet, across the web that we can tap into, hundreds of different data sources that we can pull from. And you can be as informed as humanly possible as early as possible. And that really guides the health of your project from beginning to end. So those early decisions made in site selection really have the potential to impact the entire life cycle of your project. And so if you have a project that's going to heavily impact wetlands, that's going to require permitting. Permitting might trigger different assessments down the road. It could completely change your timeline. It could change the way that you're building your site. So just knowing this information really as early as humanly possible is very important. You want to fail faster. You want to understand those red flags. When you finally have your site selected, you want to move ahead in a really efficient manner. So it's just really getting as much information as early as possible from as many available data sources. And I think oftentimes, we just get stuck in our, well, this is how we do it, right? This is how this project generally goes. And these are the data sources that we look at, but we're not thinking about all the data sources that really are just readily available at your fingertips. And that's kind of our messaging here, is that there is so much information available. Be aware of all that is out there and try to gather that as early as humanly possible.
Emily, it seems like a pretty major time investment with everything you just said as far as gathering and looking at all that, data. How do you effectively review that information in a timely manner, and what types of information are we really reviewing at this phase?
That's a great question. And, I would say 10, 20 years ago, it was a lot more difficult to gather this kind of information, a lot more time consuming. But in this day and age, we have so much technology available to us to automate this process. And so here at Terracon, we have a software as a service called Pivot. It's essentially Google Earth on steroids, and it pulls together in a visual platform all the geospatial data layers from hundreds of different sources, puts them all in one place. You've got environmental data layers, geotechnical data layers, infrastructure data layers, government data layers, and it puts all of it into one platform. You basically just draw a boundary around your site. It spits out a report that tells you, yes, I'm in a wetland. No, I'm not in a floodplain. Yes, I'm on a National Register of Historic Places property. There's a gas station across the street. This is a Native American cultural site. All with just a few clicks of a button, you can pull together all of this information, and just that knowledge is power very early in the project life cycle. But I do want to caveat that data is data, right? Like, it's only as powerful as what you do with it, and if it's in the hands of people that understand what it means. So that's where this is half of the equation. The other half of the equation is having a subject matter expert or a consultant that understands what the data means. They understand the local regulations. They've been through the processes that that particular resource might have to go through, and they can walk you through, okay, there's hydric soils, there's, potentially hydrophytic vegetation. I see this certain type of endangered species. I see this on the topo map. The topography is going a certain way. You should probably lead with a wetland delineation, right? That seems to be like your potential fatal flaw on this particular site. And so you want to have those consultants look at that data and then help you make decisions about what is important to really dig deeper in. Because you don't want to sink a whole bunch of money and time into all these different studies when there's one particular issue that really could be your fatal flaw. You want to evaluate that one issue first. And so, the data is there, it's available, it's very easy to obtain, but then you also want to have those consultants, those subject matter experts there to guide you through what it means and help walk you to the next step.
Yeah, and as you were just, highlighting that, I threw up just a visual for the group just so that they could see, generally, some of those potential pitfalls and those types of issues that could come up, whether it's on the surface or beneath the surface, but just having that type of a platform to really, dive into that data and really use that, efficiently is a really good thing. Nate, just as a, cultural, subject matter expert, when you do these types of reviews, is it a fairly similar process, or maybe you could explain a little bit about what you do?
Sure. It is very similar to what Emily already brought up. She mentioned the National Register of Historic Places. That's one of your most public data sets, but the vast majority of cultural resource data is not accessible to the general public. And this is where you really need to rely on your consultant to access those repositories, whether at the state level or the federal level. And we're taking that data of known resources, and we're doing the same thing that Emily's sort of outlined on the environmental side, which is a desktop analysis of what we know and what we can predict. The data that we're pulling from SHPOs and federal repositories is sort of twofold, and to think about it. One is actual locational data of known resources, so that can start to infer how many sites per acre might be out there, the density of known resources or the density of potentially new resources. And the other data set we're looking at is the actual resource management form that the consultant filled out in the field while they were documenting that resource. So your takeaway from that those two data sets and that review is density. What's the probability that I'm going to encounter a resource? And then based on the analysis done by the consultant, you're really finding out, are these sites really complex, or are they simple historic resources or pre-contact resources that are easily mitigated or avoided? Or in some cases, are we looking at something that's going to be far more complex from a time and research and clearing the footprint, if you will? So that's really important. So you start to get a really nice picture of your site. That's going to inform the processes farther along in the project lifecycle. One of the assessments we'll get to later. But you take that data, and I would lean into what Emily said about your consultant isn't the expert on the ground. In the case of Metcalf Archaeology, we have folks that have been practicing for more than 40 years. So you take that known resource data that you pulled in your analysis and you combine it with the institutional knowledge of your consultant, and you've got a rich picture of what you can start to expect from a cultural resource side of things. The final point that I'd like to make in this set is that while time is an issue here, most of these desktop analyses don't take a lot of time. The time constraint really comes on the back end with the agencies. So requesting the data, nowadays there's such a backlog, which is how busy everyone is. And then also we don't have positions being backfilled in some instances. So there's vacancies at these agencies. So the takeaway there is ask your consultant to start pulling this data early in that life cycle so that you don't get delayed waiting on that.
Thanks, Nate. That's a really good point. I think that leads into our next assessment now, just identifying permitting requirements and constraints, just thinking about that from a timing standpoint. I'm sure that's fairly critical. Emily, I don't know if maybe you could speak a little bit to that.
Yeah, that was a perfect segue. I think a lot of agencies are backlogged right now. There's definitely a lot of changes that have been going on in the administration. And so, the next really key thing is once you've got your information available, you need to figure out, what does your permitting look like? You have to take inventory of, okay, these are the resources I expect this type of impact. I'm in this type of jurisdiction. And what we do as consultants is called a permitting matrix. We'll go through what you're trying to do, the area that you're trying to go into. We look at all of that available information that we pulled in assessment 1, and then we start to put together a list of, okay, we anticipate maybe a Section 10 permit is required, or, it might be that you're building on federal land and the National Environmental Policy Act will come into play. So it's really important to understand and inventory the types of issues that you're going to anticipate on your project and start to look at them holistically at this stage. It's just really good planning. And of course, we all want the project to go as smoothly as possible. We hope for the best, but we plan for the worst.
Yeah, I guess, Nate, thinking about it from a cultural perspective, anything to add to that?
Well, I want to throw out something here that might not be considered on every project. We're talking about analyses done on the known site, the known boundaries, or your project footprint. But it's important to consider adjacent properties. And bringing up a project example on the federal side of things, we recently started a visual assessment of a transmission line. And what this is doing is it's looking at, what is this KV tower that's maybe going to be 100, 150 feet tall? What kind of impact might it have from a viewshed analysis on known and adjacent resources? So in this case, the federal agency set a buffer for that viewshed, 3 miles of either side of the center line. Now you can imagine that if that's a 100, 150 mile transmission line, 3 miles on either side of that thing, that is a lot of acreage. And so what you're trying to do is inform a strategy on how can we effectively conquer that challenge, really? Can we reduce the footprint and the known impact by taking more data from other sets, as Emily's brought in? as an example. Really, what's the most efficient path through this assessment that might not have been necessarily known in its scale and scope? It certainly was anticipated by the consultant, but the scale of that review was not. So in this case, I was relatively new to this project coming into Terracon. I had heard of the Pivot platform, and so I went out on a limb and I took the KMZ of the transmission line and I put it into our Pivot platform. And I was able to run reports for our GIS team to identify co-located utilities where this transmission line was already in a corridor, already alongside other utilities that were creating a visual impact on adjacent and affected properties within that corridor. And so what we were effectively able to do is take that data, work with our consulting team, federal agency, and the client, and really establish more of a compromise on what is the best value in this process. We want to know this impact. We want to know what's out there, but certainly we don't need to go back out and duplicate the work when there's known properties already affecting these resources. So that's an example of kind of a curveball that, again, you might be anticipating, but the scope could catch up on you. And so there's other tools that you need to bring into in this process to try and shrink that scope as effectively as possible while still meeting your obligations under federal compliance.
I think that's such a great example, Nate. And what's really powerful about it is the time and the money that was saved. Because if you think 150 miles, 3 miles on either side, doing full studies for all of that, that is a lot of work. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of cost. And to his point, we don't need to do all of that. We should be thinking about what is pragmatic, what's necessary for the project. So we were able to take that available utility information. And that's what's cool about Pivot is it has all of the utility information, infrastructure information, and it overlays the resources on top of it. So the agency all of a sudden has this really powerful tool available to them that they can turn on and off all these different data layers. They can see, okay, well, maybe I'm a little concerned about this area, but maybe I'm not about this area. And we can really compel them to eliminate unnecessary studies because we have all this information right at our fingertips. And it's also just a really great example of, at the stage of identifying your permit requirements, of coming up with a plan. And I think that's a nice segue into the next assessment.
Yeah, I think it is. Just think about mapping out compliance on those applicable regulations. Nate, I don't know if maybe you just want to kick us off on this one.
Sure thing. That first bullet point, I'm going to go out on a limb. Don't fear the compliance process. We're going to get you there. The earlier and more often you embrace this with your consultant, the more you can influence the outcome of your project. And that's super important because I've seen a lot of projects go sideways from a timeline and a cost perspective when we get approached 6 months before they want to break ground and there's been no engagement with the other consulting parties on the project. So embrace it. Early. Let's take what we got in these first two assessments. So let's take the desktop analyses. Let's start blending it in with, again, extra resources, extra research, the institutional knowledge of your consultant. And let's come up with not just a plan, but a strategic plan with tactics and mechanisms to get you through that process. Let's identify the priorities, the players, and the audience. And let's make sure that we are on the same page with respect to outcomes, milestones, and what is the end goal at which point we want to turn this thing on. And the best practice that I've seen here is that you lean into your local consultant because they know those players a little bit better than most of us that are not necessarily in that community. But we've found success where you start with your end date and back it up. Let's start looking at, if I have a September 30th goal to break ground on my seismic project, let's move it back into the previous year even, and say, what are the milestones that we need to critically hit to make sure that 9/30/2026 actually happens? So once again, I guess the final point I would make here is that you've engaged or you're beginning to engage with the public process here. You have a strategy in hand. You've got your consultant aligned on the tactics and mechanisms. This is the most important piece, is you have to commit. Once you're in, do not pull back, because that's just going to delay the process even further, because your audience, your stakeholders starts to get a little gun shy or lacks the confidence in how you are approaching the stewardship of this project.
Yeah, 100% early engagement is the way to go. And I think sometimes people, they get a little gun shy, like you're talking about that. Well, we're not really
Sure.
far enough along to talk to those guys yet, but then you're adding time to the back end of your project because you're not getting that necessary information that you need. So knowledge is power. You want to know as early as humanly possible what kind of triggers you have, what kind of procedures there's going to be, what type of milestones, how those study requirements are going to interplay with other permit requirements, because you might need to do, say, a cultural resource study for a bunch of different agencies in the process, and you don't want to have to do it multiple times. You want to do it one time. So efficiency is really important in this stage. It's really, assessment 1 is about knowledge is power. Get as much information as you possibly can. Assessment 2 is about what is in the recipe? What are the permits that we anticipate for this project? And this is really a critical stage, because this is when you're tactical about what you need to do next. You're mapping out what is the critical path, what's the long tent in the pole, what are the assessments that I need, how do those assessments get affected by other permits required in the process, how do these timelines overlay on top of each other. It's really useful to put a Gantt milestone chart of all of the different layers of permitting that you have, when they happen, and what they require. So this is really when the good decisions get made in a process. And just to give an example of just some of the complexity that we see, we've got a project that's 5,000 miles of fiber. It crosses, I think, 5 different federal agencies, several state agencies, DOT right-of-way. There is federal funding, state funding. I mean, the amount of complexity that is in this particular project is wild. And you really need to be as tactical as possible, be armed with that information, know all of the permitting that's required for those different agencies. And if you can get them in the room and all be talking at the same time about this holistic project that is combining all of these groups together, that's even better. I mean, communication is so vital, and making sure that the agencies are aware of what the agency is doing and, you know, what the different requirements are, that can really help streamline some of these things and how the different permits interplay with one another. And you can have a simple project, even the most simple project still benefits from a good permitting plan.
Yep.
So I'm hearing
Embrace
you,
the process, right? Embrace the process.
and I'm hearing you both speak about, earlier the better, often engagement, all this type of engagement. For me as an engineer, when I hear early, I mean, I always want to assign something to it, to say like this is what early means. Because early for me, if I wake up in the morning, might be 5 a.m. and it might be 3 a.m. for somebody else. So could either of you speak to like what really, is there a time point, like a specific time point that would be critical to make sure that we are engaging early enough?
It's a good question, Rob. I would say, unfortunately, it depends. It really depends on what you've really gathered in those first 2 assessments. That starts to inform the timeline that you can expect. A hard and fast example might be a class 1 review or a literature review in the cultural resource space. Typically, agencies honor that data set for up to a year. So you can start to get a snapshot of your site and your project footprint really early in the process and still rely on that data and not have to duplicate that effort later on. But it really is a moving target, and that's why you want to, again, lean into this process, lean into your consultant's expertise, especially on the local level, so that you can tighten up that timeline as much as possible, because with time goes cost.
Yeah, I would echo that sentiment. Of course, we don't want to say it depends, but it does depend. And I always think of everything in terms of the project life cycle, that first slide that we showed. And every sector of work that we do, whether it's transportation, whether it's digital infrastructure, power, gas, and transmission, all of these different sectors, they follow a project life cycle. And it might be different from the other, sectors that we work in, but the ideas are all still the same. And the idea being, get as much information as you can as early on, identify those permits, and then just try to map out what the best optimal permitting plan will look like. And the earlier you do that, the better. And it may be that the particular type of project you work in has sort of a set cycle of when things are done. That does not mean that's how you have to do it. Just because a transportation process in a certain state has a prescriptive path, and it's got initial and then design and then concept, all of these different phases that it has to go through, you can be armed with knowledge as early as you want to be in the process. And I think that's an important distinction, because people tend to fall into, well, this is the way that it's done. And it doesn't have to be that way. You can have as much information and be armed and make good decisions earlier if that is useful for you.
really good points. I guess just, whenever you think it might be too early, it's probably not too early enough.
Probably not.
Well, let's segue into our fourth assessment on uncovering funding sources and recognizing associated project impacts. I'm curious about how, talking about timing and everything, how that kind of fits in with this particular subject as well.
Yes, we thought this was important to bring up with just the wide amount of federal funding that has been going out these past couple of years with IRA and BIL and all of the different funds. We've got USDA funding, Department of Energy funding, NTIA, all of these billions of dollars that are flowing out there. And it's low hanging fruit, right? If you're trying to build all of these different types of projects to tap into that funding. And so what we want to caveat here is that, oftentimes we've got private developers who used to working on private projects on private land that don't have a federal nexus. And so what's important to know about a federal nexus is that it pulls in a couple of different key regulations. It pulls in the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, as well as the National Historic Preservation Act, or Section 106 as it's often referred to. And those two things require the applicant to consider the environmental impacts of that action on the environment and on historic preservation and cultural resources. So suddenly you go from, oh, I just do a phase one when a phase one, maybe a geotech report. Those are the due diligence things that I perform. All of a sudden, now you need to do a wetland delineation. Now you have to survey for endangered species and consider Section 7. Now you might have to do a full phase one cultural resource survey and get a shovel archaeological test every 30 meters. You might have to do transportation studies. You might have to consider impacts to the local community, air and noise. All of these different things are outside the realm of a typical private developer, but they're all very important for these federally funded projects. And it's also important to note that it's not just getting the data, but the process of doing the assessment, of understanding what your project is, how it impacts those resources, and then how that gets documented and conveyed with the public and turned into a decision document is a process. It doesn't happen overnight. It can be, as short as a month for a quick checklist categorical exclusion. It could be long as several years for an environmental impact survey. So all of these things, they add time, they add money, they add complexity, and you need to be aware of that. And so the earlier that you know that you're going to be anticipating federal funding, that's when you want to get those studies done. And I just want to throw in one more note that a lot of misinformation is going out there right now because of some of the executive orders that have gone out. The CEQ rules have kind of been depowered and moved to the side. That does not mean that NEPA is not a thing anymore. NEPA is a law. It is very much still in place. We are very much still implementing it. But the taking away the CEQ rules basically just goes back to the federal agency. It's up to the federal agency to rely on their own NEPA rules. So USDA, DOE, FCC, FAA, all of these agencies have their own set of NEPA rules that they're following. And so we're just diverting back to that. The other two major changes that have occurred with regards to NEPA are environmental justice and climate change have been somewhat removed from that process, but there's still other ways that we talk about them in NEPA. For example, we might still talk about similar types of issues as environmental justice in the socioeconomic section. We still have an air quality section in the NEPA document, but it might not call it climate change, right? So all of these things are very much alive and well. It's just the way that we're looking at them and practicing them that looks a little bit different.
So I'd like to make one important point really quick, Rob, on that. It's important to note that a Section 106 review might occur independent of NEPA or Section 4F of DOT. Just because NEPA or 4F doesn't trigger a 106 review, make sure you keep in mind that NHPA might actually apply separately to your undertaking here. So that's one thing that can be overlooked, but just come out of nowhere, and all of a sudden you're maybe a month or two behind on said study.
So what kind of time and cost could be expected for a project that goes from being privately funded to federally funded?
Oh, I knew you were going to ask that, Rob. My crystal ball. It's really, it's just like the other question. It really depends, right? Because a really small project with an agency whose NEPA rules have a high amount of categorical exclusion. So I'll give you an example, right? If you're deploying a small cell telecommunications facility in an active above ground utility right of way, there are particular exclusions for those types of projects, and they may actually to cause you to just have to do a piece of paper, just one checklist item for that particular scope of work. But for DOT or for a transportation project, it could be a categorical exclusion that could take 6 months to a year. If it's a large energy project taking place on a lot of land, or a particularly complex action with an agency that has a complex set of regulations, then that could be a couple of years. It could be upwards of millions of dollars. So it really is just highly dependent on the action. It's highly dependent on the agency, and all of those things have to be taken into consideration. So I wish there was just a magic, it costs X amount of dollars, but unfortunately it's not.
Well, before we move on to the final assessment, Nate, anything else you'd like to add to the topic?
Just that I think Emily hit the nail right on the head. It depends. With the federal process comes a lot more public scrutiny. I'd like to advocate for the idea that engaging and embracing the public process could actually be a very good defensive strategy as you start to roll out your own offensive strategy to make sure that this project is seen through to success. And by that, I mean, you can rely on your consultant, you can rely on the public agencies to work with your constituents there. And in the reviews that you conduct under the federal lens, you're offering more and more information to a community that is curious. And the more informed they are, the less they can guess about what is actually happening on your project. So again, be ready with that approach. If you know you're going from private to federal, know what to expect. Just don't walk in there, empty-handed. Make sure that your team's in place, your consultant is aligned with what your critical path is and your milestones and outcomes want to be. And then when it comes to the thing that Emily introduced right here, the topic of public policy, there's a lot of winds blowing right now and a lot of nuances and changes that are happening. And that's where I'm hoping that in our Q&A session coming up, you can tap Eric Wooten for some of those questions.
Well, I mean, just overall, as we're kind of getting through our presentation here, there's a lot of key takeaways that I'm getting from this. And obviously, engaging your consultant early in the process, there really is no early to speak of. It's just, as early and often as you can. It can be nuanced, it can be complex. So really rely on your consultant to help you navigate through this type of process and leverage technology to help make it more efficient. So Nate, you're going to have to help me with this number 5, because if I'm working on a project and I don't need to go through public relations and community engagement, it seems to me like I could save a lot of time by just kind of ignoring this and just keeping it at 4 critical assessments. So can you help explain why this is important, whether it's needed or not?
No.
Oh, I'd like to see, I'd like to see if by a show of hands of our audience members today, what project was not known by the public at the end of the day. So that's my segue into, you've engaged with your stakeholders, you started to reach out with agency consultation. And I said earlier on assessment 3, this is your commitment. Don't shy away from it now. You're fully there. You've arrived in this community with a vision. You're bringing an asset to this community in some form or fashion. And that's going to have an impact, a noticeable impact. And an impact doesn't always have to be a negative, adverse. It could be a very positive impact to the community. But when you're arriving at this stage in the game, you're informed. You've got your reviews done, or at least in hand. You know, if it's a federally funded project, you know what reviews you got to check off your list. But you also know if it's a private development, you're informed more with the local considerations, the local permitting, the local statutes, and even the temperature of the audience, the community. How are they looking at your project and things like that? Are they going to embrace this just like you've stepped into that role, or are they a little bit resistant on what is actually occurring in their community? This is where that frequent communication comes into play. This is where you lean into your consultant again. They're the local experts. You've engaged them, utilize them. That's really the way that I found that you can remove a lot of friction in the process, especially when you're working with the public, because once again, if it's federal, it's going to be very much a public process. Finally, I think it's really important to know that you might be building this asset for the community and then you're moving on to your next project. Keep in mind that your project, the actual asset that you're leaving behind the community, is a long-term partner to that community. So the better you are as a steward coming in from a heritage standpoint. And I like to say that all heritage is local, meaning that's national heritage, our environment around us, and that's cultural heritage, our history and our culture. The more you lean into that, as far as I'm a steward, that will make a great neighbor for your project.
I think that's all really good advice, Nate. And I will just say that whether your project is privately funded or federally or, publicly funded, it is still important to have good community engagement because opposition to a project can kill it. They can find ways through the planning and zoning mechanisms. They can even do it just through social media these days. There's just so many avenues for people to oppose things. And so it's really an important step to take regardless of what type of project that you do have. So regardless, I think it's important to get initial baseline information and understand how your types of projects that you're putting in there are received in that local community. Understand the community that you're going into. There's a lot of clients that we work for that they go in very, very early and they collect as much data as they can, as covertly as they can, to just understand what they're working with and understand a plan for, okay, what's the best way to start to reach out to this community? We want to understand who they are, and then we want to figure out what's the best way to tap into them. And then they might start going door to door. Maybe they'll have meetings with strategic partners or, find out where the concerns are so that they can focus their efforts on making sure that those particular concerns are alleviated. And then they weave their way into the process instead of just, coming in there, here's a public meeting, we're putting in a road. It just goes so much smoother when you engage with the public early. And I will also say that on those federal projects or those projects that do necessitate the stakeholders, you want to be as armed as humanly possible with that information so that things don't come up in public meetings that might be a surprise. I've had some projects where some pretty sensational things were brought up in a public meeting that I think it would have really behooved to have had some information about that prior to the meeting. You just never want that to be the situation that something gets brought up. So, early engagement and just strategic engagement, I think, is a really useful way to think about it.
Those are all really good points. Well, before we get to maybe some of the Q&A session here, Nate, you had brought up, a little bit on the government affairs. Eric, maybe you could speak to a little bit on this.
Yes, absolutely. And I really want to build off of what we've heard from Emily and Nate, that right now we're in an environment where there's a lot of noise. And so what we'd like to do is kind of provide a framework for how you can cut through that noise to get data-driven insights and to really focus on what drives your practice. So for governmental affairs, what does that really mean? I kind of break that into 3 buckets, those big bolded points you see. The executive and legislative branches, federal regulations and the agencies that implement those, and then also considering state regulations, NGOs, investors, insurers, and consumer demand. So when you look at federal regulations, that's one part of the equation. The executive and legislative branch, they add another part of the equation. But you've really got those local and regional drivers, like where your companies that you're supporting may have investors or insurers that really want to see a certain approach taken. They may have consumers dictating that they still focus on certain aspects that may have been changed or a little bit different approach taken by the current administration. So how can you do that? One of the big things that I'd offer as a takeaway is focus on what actually happens. There's a lot of headlines and a lot of noise. When you hear an executive order come out, that is not self-implementing. It's not self-executing. Those executive orders really direct agencies to go do things. And that's what we're starting to see now, is a lot of responses from agencies to executive orders, where those agencies are prioritizing either new rulemakings, revisiting existing regulations and seeing if they're burdensome or have an opportunity to kind of dial back what's required. And so as we do that, what you can do is dial in to what has been signed by Congress, or signed by the president, and it's moved through the full houses of Congress to become a law. We've not seen too many laws to date in the first 100 days. We are at President Trump and the Trump administration's 100th day today. We've only seen a handful of signed bills. And so really what we're starting to see is those regulatory agencies responding to the executive orders, setting out agendas, teeing up certain actions they're going to take. There's a WOTUS listening session that starts today, and there's a few other WOTUS listening sessions that'll be in the next couple of days. And so if WOTUS is something that impacts your practice and your clients, I'd encourage you, while you're working, have the listening session in on the background. Listen for those key words. And so focus on the signed legislation, what actually becomes law. And more than that, look at the Federal Register. You can go in and set updates for specific agencies to be able to get updates or alerts whenever they issue something in the Federal Register. So that might be a notice of proposed rulemaking. It may be something of requesting information. And so that's where you can get kind of that key information to cut through the noise. And like we do with Pivot and our in-house experts, get those insights that really move your practice forward and help with what you're focused on as a company to add value to your shareholders. And so I'm happy to entertain questions in the Q&A. I will provide as much as I possibly can, but I'll also drop contact information in here that if you've got questions on governmental affairs or regulations and how it's impacting the work you do and the communities you serve, reach out. It's something we're dedicating a lot of time and effort to because it really can move the needle on the services we're providing to our clients.
Thank you so much for that, Eric. And I just wanted to also tap onto that, as subject matter experts and consultants at Terracon, for each of our practice areas, we are, of course, following what's going on in Washington and following how it changes the practices that we have. So, I gave NEPA as an example, the CEQ, the EJ, the climate change. Those are real ways that those executive orders are impacting our practice, and we're very well aware of them. And so I wanted to plug that we'll actually be having in this national webinar series a NEPA policy webinar. I believe that's scheduled sometime in early May. So please, be on the lookout for that. They might be able to drop the information about that webinar into the chat. So if you're really interested in NEPA and what's going to become of NEPA and what it looks like in this day and age, then there will be a webinar on that. But, you brought up WOTUS and, with SACIT and with the recent rule changes, I feel like every year goes by, we've got a new set of WOTUS rules that we've got to work with. And so, we're constantly tracking that. We're constantly pivoting and changing the way that we're doing things and looking at things from a different angle, but we're tracking it all the time. So our wetland delineations teams, they're very well aware of those changes and what they mean and tracking them as they go. So, lean on your consultants, lean on your SMEs. We're here to help. This is what we do day in and day out. And we love to answer questions about this. We nerd out on this stuff. So we're happy to help.
We do. And Emily, I'd be remiss if I didn't insert a bad dad joke here. So WOTUS is a perpetually fluid topic. Every administration seems to change it and tweak it to kind of suit their needs a little bit. And so I think that's something we can monitor and help y'all with. And really, like Emily said, we do nerd out on this stuff, and you can see there's a lot of passion in this room and on this webinar. So we appreciate y'all tuning in to kind of learn and just know we embrace the questions. We welcome them.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you all very much. I just love these key takeaways, tracking signed legislation, making sure that we keep track of that, making sure that you do have a trusted consultant that is also tracking that information and can speak to that when you need it. Engage your consultants early and often, and just making sure that we're leveraging our technologies to make this process a little bit more efficient and streamlined. So we come to the end of our 5 critical assessments, and we're going to go ahead and head into the Q&A session right now. I'm just going to go ahead and check that and pull up what we've got so far. And please feel free to start typing in questions as you have them. The first question we have, our firm typically engages with local legal firms for permitting strategy, including community outreach and support, separate from our de-risking due diligence. Does Terracon offer similar services?
We absolutely do help with initial permitting. I think it's important to remember when you engage with legal groups, they're thinking with the law in mind, and they're coming from that set of expertise. So that's where subject matter experts, you might talk to a legal expert who's studying the law and they understand how all of those implications trickle through different areas, but they may not know the nuance of how it's actually been implemented and what it was like to practice it for the last several years and how granular the changes may be. So I think it's important to have both. I think it's very useful to engage legal counsel early to help you with your permitting plan, but it does not replace subject matter experts. And it depends on the types of issues that you have, what types of subject matter experts that you would engage. But I always recommend someone that understands the particular practice and the geography as well, who's familiar with that local area.
Yep. And Rob, I'll add that It's essentially what we're doing every day in our services. That's an advocacy role that you see in that question. Moreover, I really see an opportunity where we could actually get engaged more in the process that you're going through. So we better understand those other constraints on the legal side that perhaps a subject matter expert just needs to blend, as Emily mentioned. We need to blend our own expertise with that outcome.
Great, thank you. One other question in here from Tom asking if the slide deck will be shared after the conclusion of the webinar. And yes, we will be sharing this after the conclusion along with the recording.
And Rob, I did see a question come in on funding and programs under the Biden administration and whether funding will continue. And that's something I'm happy to address. So what we're typically seeing with funding under the Biden administration programs is if those funds are obligated, they're continuing. If you've already got the application approved and you're working through the program and the project, that's something where we're seeing the funds continue to flow to folks. Where you may have had a pending application or there may still be funding available, that's where we're seeing the administration currently a little less eager to fund under certain Biden programs. So IRA, Inflation Reduction Act, you've got a lot of funds that were obligated. Those projects are moving forward. The funds are flowing to grant recipients like the climate pollution reduction grants. So if you've got a project that you're wondering about the funding, reach out to us and that's something we can look at, see where it is in the process and kind of provide some strategic guidance moving forward, as well as additional funding opportunities, money that may be out there that we've been looking at and researching that we can apply to the projects you're moving forward with.
Thank you, Eric. Okay, we have one other question that came into the chat. The program that you mentioned early in the presentation that was the Google Earth on steroids, is that just available for Terracon and what was it called? Good question. That is a program that's called Pivot. It is available for all of our Terracon practitioners to use and they are using it currently to help with their workflow. And it is also available externally for our clients as well. So if that is something that you're interested in learning more about, I'm happy to connect with you after the session, John, and maybe we can set up a time to review that in a little bit more detail. And for anybody else on the call that would like to review that in more detail as well. Okay, and we have another one coming in from Kevin. Do you have any suggestions for how to deal with different agencies and different field offices that have conflicting or contradictory directions in relation to NEPA compliance?
Oh, I wish I could solve this for you. I'm very familiar with it. I'm familiar with even within the same field office giving conflicting direction. I'm familiar with iterations of reports where one reviewer says, do it one way, and then you send it back and they change reviewers, and the reviewer says, no, do it this other way. So and that's one thing that I really appreciated about CEQ was that the rules at least gave us a playbook of, hey, we're all playing off the same set of rules here. Now there's no playbook. Now it really is every agency for themselves. So when you think about it that way, I don't think that problem in particular is going away. I wish I could tell you how to navigate it better than that, but that it is important to have an awareness and a rapport with whoever your reviewer is. I think that's what's really important is understand your reviewer, understand what their needs are, what their hot buttons are, what they're going to be looking for, and proactively communicate that as much as possible. Just communication is key. But then, you know, when another reviewer gets thrown into the process and you're not familiar with them, that's always going to be a little bit tricky. But you just try to have that good communication and awareness and relationship with your reviewer, and that does really help. And of course, we always write everything down. So once we've worked with someone, we know what it's like. We have a little playbook that we go by, and we just try to use that moving forward.
Yeah. Rob, 2 points quickly to add. Lean on your consultant. This is the local relationship that Emily's mentioning with respect to rapport. And then also, this is where you want to have your consultant in every room. You know, please don't meet independently with your competing agency folks out there. Bring your consultant with you because, again, that institutional knowledge of how to work with those nuances among field offices and among players, that's what we do best.
Yeah, those relationships are what we've worked really hard to build.
Well, I just want to thank all of our presenters today. Appreciate your time and effort in putting this together and speaking to the group. Very informative. It was great to have everybody on the call. Just have some contact information for some of our presenters here. If you'd like to reach out individually, we're also happy to just set up times for anything else that you'd like to dive into with a little bit more detail. So with that, thank you very much. Oh, and I just realized we don't have Eric's contact information on here.
We can drop it in the chat.
Yeah, let me grab his email address here. And
I often work behind the scenes, but I'm happy to have folks reach out. I enjoy the
Just
questions. I enjoy the dialogue. Again, like Emily said, we nerd out on this stuff and I love it. So I'm happy to help folks.
yeah,
You
thanks,
can't
Eric.
hide from us, Eric.
We all hang
We
out
will
together
find
anyway, so one way or another, we'll get to you. All right. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day and your week, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.